Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jardine Santa Ana, and I'm here to talk about evidence based decision making using economic analysis. Now, I know the subject of economic analysis is quite vast, and it would be impossible for us to finish everything in this 30-minute on demand video. However, let's try to review some concepts about economics and medical economics, and hopefully be able to understand these concepts for us to appreciate the different economic evaluation processes. These processes are usually used or utilized in order for health policymakers to arrive at sound decisions that will stand to benefit a lot of people. So, let us begin. When talking about economics, we need to remember just two things. First of all, resources are scarce or limited. However, the needs of human beings are quite unlimited and they keep on adding up and adding up. And the trick in economics is trying to balance the needs with the resources that are available. So it's all about making choices. The goal of economics is actually to maximize the benefits or the outputs with the least amount of expenditures. Economics is the study of how people make decisions. So this, however, has some limitations. No? Economics mainly pertains to money, no, monetary resources, no, and other resources that are used to trade in um, the outputs that would benefit a lot of people. However, there is no emotional, ethical, moral, or spiritual considerations in the subject of economics. Now, when we talk about medical economics, it is the application of economics in the medical field. It is also known as health economics. And in health economics, you are concerned with efficiency, effectiveness, value and behavior in the production and consumption of health and healthcare. Now, clinicians are often asked to participate in making decisions for groups of patients. Now, whether to set a clinical policy for an institution or to set a health policy on a more macro level. Now, clinicians need to not only weigh the risk and benefits of treatment, but should also consider whether these benefits will be worth the healthcare resources that is consumed. And that is why economic analysis is here. No? It is a set of formal quantitative methods used to compare alternative strategies. So you're looking at two options and you're looking at them in terms of the amount of resources that will be consumed in obtaining that health medical option and the expected outcomes that you can derive from consuming those resources. So Drummond in 2005 defines economic analysis as the comparison of alternative courses of action in terms of both their costs and consequences. Now, the use of resources, our decisions in using such resources, is often dictated by two concepts. The first of which is the price of goods and services. Of course, everything in this world costs money, and since the resources are limited, we need to be smart about allocating these resources for certain goods. The next thing that influences our decision in the use of resources is what is known as utility. It is defined as the happiness a person gains from consuming a certain commodity. In this case, a certain health service. So what satisfaction do I obtain in purchasing a certain treatment or in consulting a certain doctor? What satisfaction do I obtain? Is that doctor attentive to my needs? And is he able to alleviate my illnesses? Okay, so let us look at this illustration of economic decision making. Now, in economic decision making, we have to consider the costs and consequences of each of our options. This can include therapeutic options or even diagnostic interventions. Now, comparing these factors isn't always easy. So some science has been put into place to help us with this decision-making process. And we'll be looking later on at the different economic evaluation methods. Now, the decisions we make in medical economics can differ greatly. And this is based on what perspective we take. When we deal with decisions, we have to consider the perspective by which the decision is made from. In medical economics, there are three perspectives that we can use: the patient perspective, the health system perspective, and the societal perspective. Now, in patient perspective, let's say your patient has a certain illness and he now has to choose what treatment option should he or she take, which doctor should he or she consult to, and will it be worthwhile or will it be worth his money to obtain such treatment. So, patient perspective is the simplest type of perspective. It deals with the patient's out of pocket costs. The next type of perspective is the health system perspective. Now, this deals with the health system's cost. No? How much is the health system willing to pay for additional services? Let's say a certain hospital, will it be worthwhile for a hospital to purchase MRI, no? Or will it be too expensive and will it be beyond their budget, and will they stand to that benefit from it? Now, they also need to consider what limitations should be applied in a certain health system and how much should the health system pay for this treatment. The next perspective is the societal perspective. Now, the societal perspective is more complex. Um, it is more broad and complex in its scope, no? And it doesn't only deal with the patient's cost, but also with the health system costs and costs from other sectors as well. Now, the societal perspective is the one that is used in health policy decisions pertaining to a more macro level, on a more macro level. Now let us talk about costs. Costs are defined as the total net expenditures related to a certain intervention. So it includes not only the cost of medications, the cost of hospitalizations, but you have to also take into account the possible side effects that may arise from a certain intervention. And you have to have enough money to cover for this, no, in case you need to address these treatment side effects. And it also, you're also considering the future possible savings from a certain intervention that would be preventive and that would lead to less morbidity. Now, there are four types of costs. The first one is the healthcare resources that is consumed. So this includes the cost of setting up and running a health program. It also includes the possible adverse effects attributed to a certain program. And it covers both your variable costs and fixed costs. Now, the next type of cost would be the cost of patient or patient's family resources. This refers to the out-of-pocket payments incurred by the patient when he purchases a certain health service. The next type of cost is your productivity losses. This is the losses you obtain when you become absent from work due to the illness. No? If you're sick, no, you take a few days off work. Of course, you don't get paid for those. Sometimes you don't get paid for those days that you are off. And then the last would be the cost due to consumption of other resources. No? So these are the resources that is consumed by sectors other than the health sector. Okay, so now let us delve into the different types of economic analysis or economic evaluation. The first is cost of illness or burden of analysis. Now, cost of illness examines the cost of addressing a certain disease. It does not examine the consequences, no, or it does not really look into the effectiveness, but it only computes for the amount of money that is inclusive of treating a certain illness. So an example of this would be burden of illness study on community-acquired pneumonia. No, you're not only looking at the cost of hospitalization, but you're also looking at the total cost of treating pneumonia. So this includes the hospitalization and the medications that the patient will need to take 1 week post-discharge. When you're doing your cost of illness or your burden of illness study, you need to define uh, the direct and indirect medical costs. The next type of economic evaluation is the cost minimization analysis. So this examines the cost of care between two treatment options that are assumed to be of equal effectivity. So you're not looking actually at the the health benefits already because you make an assumption that each treatment option would yield the same effect. So you are just looking now at the cost of the treatment and you are made to decide on a more cheaper option. Of course, if a certain drug A and drug B are compared, no, you the in cost minimization analysis, you assume that drug A is equally as effective as drug B. So your decision is based only now on the cost of drug A versus drug B. The next type of economic evaluation is your cost effectiveness analysis. Now, your cost effective analysis, you look at outcomes that are measured in health units. An example of this would be the heart attacks avoided. No? When you treat hypertension, you use antihypertensive drug, uh, a statin, and a blood thinner in order to prevent heart attacks. So you try to measure the effect of a certain drug or a certain intervention and how it affects the patients. So another example would be deaths avoided, no? The amount of HbA1c reduction. So those are the outcomes that you're looking at, biological outcomes. So in cost effectiveness analysis, the outcomes must be measured in the same units in order for you to compare them. You cannot compare oranges from apples. Like for example, in a costing study, if it looked at reduction in HbA1c, whereas in another costing study, it looked mainly on the reduction in albuminuria. So you cannot really compare them because they're looking at different outcomes. In performing cost effectiveness analysis, you expect to get the following results. No? Your results are expressed as cost all over effect. So here are a few examples. So for example, it would cost 5,000 pesos for for a 10 milligram per deciliter reduction in LDL levels. Or for example, you will need to invest 100,000 pesos in order to prevent one stroke. So in cost effectiveness analysis, it would be helpful for us to be able to illustrate these concepts using a cost effectiveness plane. So to help us weigh the benefits versus the costs, now let's use the CE plane. Now, here we have two planes, one for expenses, the y-axis, and the other is for outcomes, or the x-axis. Now the center of the plane is the comparator. It is the main option which we would like to compare other options with. No? This may be the standard treatment of care, or in case of diagnostic test, no? This could be your gold standard. No? Or it can even be placebo, or it can even be the action of doing nothing. Anything that you compare a new intervention with. We can then chart our options in this plane to see which options will give us better value for our money. The options which are on the upper left quadrant are worse in both respects, while the ones in the lower right quadrant are better in both costs and outcomes. So there's a tendency for us to choose those in the lower right quadrant because you get a lot more benefits with less amount of money to consume. Now, it doesn't make sense for us to choose options that are in the left upper quadrant. For example, a certain vaccine may be more expensive And if you would look at its effectiveness study, it would only yield, let's say, a 50% effectivity rate, and it is even characterized by more side effects. So it's probably not worthwhile to invest on such a vaccine. Uh, for instance, let us plot a set of options on this plane. No? For example, we have vaccine option 1 to 7. And here we can see how these options differ from the comparator in both effectiveness and cost. The question here, though, is which ones are cost effective? The obvious answer would be option 5 and option 7 because they are cheaper and they yield better outcomes. Now, for option 4 and option 6, the answer is not quite so clear as of yet. No, for option 6, for example, it will yield far better outcome than the comparator, but it is more expensive. So the question here now is, will you be willing to invest a lot more money in order for you to obtain that additional effect? In option 4, we can see here that it's quite expensive compared to the comparator, but the amount of benefits are minimal. So is it worthwhile to invest in option 4? That would depend on a person's willingness to pay. Or on a more large scale level, what society is willing to pay. So in cost effectiveness analysis, we need to be familiar with some basic CE formulas. The first of which is your average CE ratio, or your average cost effectiveness ratio, also known as ACER. So it is computed using the formula cost all over effectiveness. So an example, let's say in a hip replacement program, the cost would be 150,000, and you're able to save 3 lives because you invested on 150,000. So 150,000 per 3 lives saved is equivalent to an ACER of 50,000 per life saved. But the more important formula in your cost effectiveness evaluation, because you are looking at two options, is the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or the ICER. So the formula, quite similar to ACER, the cost is still all over effectiveness, but this time you're looking at the difference between the cost of two treatment options all over the difference in effectiveness between those two treatment options. So you get the difference first, and then you divide it by the difference in effectiveness. So let's give an example of how to use the ICER. We have standard care, or SC. In standard care, the cost is 150,000 pesos, and it was able to provide a benefit of preventing 3 strokes. Next is Standard Care Plus. Now, this is your new option, no, wherein it would cost 600,000 for you to prevent 6 strokes. No, computing for the ICER for Standard Care Plus versus Standard Care, we utilize the formula, substitute the values. So we get the difference first between the cost between the two options, and then we get the difference between the effectiveness between the two options, and then you just divide. So substituting the values, we get 150,000 pesos per stroke prevented. So this is the ICER of Standard Care compared to Standard Care Plus. Okay, going back now to the cost effectiveness plane, there is a question on how much the decision maker or society willing to spend for a certain treatment option. Now, this value will tell us how much the decision maker is willing to spend and can be plotted on the chart as the ceiling ratio, also known as the threshold value, or the ICER threshold. So in this illustration, it is the red dotted line. Okay, and this coincides with the decision maker's willingness to pay. No, so if the treatment option will fall above the ICER threshold, then we can say that the decision maker, let's say the patient or the medical institution or society at large, is no longer interested in investing additional amount of money to get the additional benefit that the treatment option can offer. So, but below the ICER threshold, these are options that can probably be adapted in making health policies, and it would inform the patient in making a sound decision. Now, to concretize those concepts, here we present some examples. The first example is comparing a new drug versus the standard drug. So the standard drug, let's just label that as drug A, and the new drug is drug B. Now, in terms of effects, now drug A will provide you with 25 life years. So you would probably live 25 more years, no, if you use drug A. In contrast to drug B, in comparison to drug B yields a 25.5 life years, additional life years. So, getting now the difference in the effects between drug A and drug B, you have a zero point 0.5 life year benefit in drug B compared to drug A. So, we now know that the new drug is more effective. But what is the incremental cost effect? To answer that, you need to know the cost. So let's say you perform the cost of illness study on drug A and drug B, and then you were able to get the costs. So drug A costs 2,000 pesos, while drug B costs 4,000 pesos. So you now get the difference between the costs, and you also get the difference between the effectiveness. So plotting and substituting these values now in your ICER formula, you get 4,000 pesos per life years gain. So that means it costs 4,000 pesos to obtain an additional life year. On the second example, we can so you're still comparing drug A with drug B, but this time, no, drug B is cheaper than drug A. The new drug is cheaper than the standard drug. Let's look at the effects. No? Drug A would give you 25 life years, while drug B will give you 26 life years. So you have an additional life year benefit with drug B. So get the difference between the two. Actually, you don't need to really compute for the ICER, no, because it seems to be pretty obvious, no, that you would choose drug B because it's cheaper and it is more effective than drug A. Now, how about more than comparing more than two drugs? No? So if we're dealing with more than one comparator, what we can do is line them up. No, we have more than one comparator. What we can do is line them up, calculate all their costs, and calculate their average effects. Now, the effects here in this study are the number of disease-free days. So treatment A, you cost 957, but it would give you 16.86 days. No, compared to drug B, cheaper, it's 634, but it will give you 9.05 disease-free days. So these you can compute for your ACER. But we won't stop at computing their ACER. We won't make a decision based on their ACER alone. No? What we will do is plot the cost per effect or plot the ACER for each of those drugs on a plane. So if we're dealing with more than one comparator and we're trying to get the ICER, we can plot them in this graph. No? When we plot the ACER of these drugs, so this is the ACER of drug A, ACER of drug B, ACER of drug C, and drug D. No? And then we connect them with lines. what we are doing is actually we're revealing the ICER, no? So the slopes between treatment B versus C, for example, that is actually the ICER for treatment B and treatment C. So the ICER for treatment A and treatment B, on the other hand, is depicted in this slope. No? So what we can do in order for us to determine which is more cost effective, we look at the slope at of the line. No? So the least steep slope, no? The flatter slope would be would represent the greatest value for money. No? So in this case, no, the ICER of slope B versus slope C, of drug B versus drug C is flatter than the slope of A versus B and C versus D. So this is actually the ICER of drug B versus drug C. And it seems to be the more cost-effective option. No? So so while treatment C is effective, treatment B would give you more benefits, but it would come at a higher cost. But maybe it is worthwhile to spend for that because the effects of drug B far exceeds the effects of drug C. So what does cost-effective mean? It means that the cost-effective strategy is of good value. No? So the ICER should still fall within the willingness to pay line or the ICER threshold. So being cost effective doesn't always mean that is the cheaper option. It can be the more expensive option yielding the greatest amount of benefit. And just because a strategy saves money doesn't mean it is cost effective. So in the example a while ago, it seems that option 6 is cost effective. But that would the defining a cost effective treatment approach would be dictated by the perspective of a person. So perspective matters. So what you think is a good price for an additional outcome, someone else may not. So for example, as a patient, no, a patient may think that investing for a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine with that covers 13 strains may be worthwhile to pay more money. But on a societal perspective, wherein the Department of Health will do mass vaccination programs, it may not be cost effective to buy that more expensive vaccine, although it covers more strains, but on a societal perspective, it may not be so beneficial. So it would really depend on which perspective you use. Next is cost utility analysis. Cost utility analysis is a subset of your cost effectiveness analysis. It also looks at different costs and outcomes, and you compare these costs and outcomes. However, the main difference here between cost utility analysis and cost effectivity analysis is that the cost utility analysis looks at utility values. No? The outcomes are measured in utility values. What are these utility values again? No? Remember, we defined utility as the happiness or the satisfaction a person obtains from using a certain health service. So, in cost utility analysis, you're not just looking at the number of years that you would gain from taking a certain intervention, but how is your quality of life at those additional number of years, no? So maybe taking a certain drug, you get to live 5 more years versus the other drug. However, if those 5 years you're miserable, you have a lot of disabilities, you have a lot of comorbidities, you're very functionally dependent, then maybe that is not such a desirable outcome. So again, in cost utility analysis, you're placing values, utility values, on quantitative values. So quantity of life is multiplied by utility weights, and that would result into your quality adjusted life years or disability adjusted life years. Let us expound more on quality adjusted life years. So as mentioned, utilities are weights which are based on measurable preferences for different health states. Now, more desirable health states would mean greater utilities, whereas less desirable health states or poorer state of health would incur lower utilities. So you can think of utilities as a range between 0 to 1, wherein 1 is perfect health and 0 is death. So anything in between 0 and 1, that would correspond now to your utilities. Okay, so once again, QALY is computed using utility times life years. Just to illustrate with the use of examples, let's say we have patient A and patient B. Now, both patient A and patient B lived up to 40 years old. Patient A was born with a very good life, no? He or she has a utility of 1 at the start of life. But this patient A began to have a deteriorating quality of life over the next 3 decades. In comparison to patient B was born with a zero point 0.5 utility. So, but however, patient B was stable all throughout the 4 decades of life. So the question now is, who has a better quality, patient A or patient B? So patient B lived till also lived till 40 years old, no, with a stable utility compared to patient A who began deteriorating as the decades went by. But can we safely say that patient B has a better utility than patient A? Because at the end of life, no, patient B had a better quality of life over the last decade of life compared to patient A. But when we compute for the QALY, no, QALY is computed by the number of years or the time spent in that certain quality of life. No? So for patient A, during the first 10 years of his life, the utility was at 1. And then at the next decade, no, the quality of life went down a bit, so it's zero point 0.8, and then zero point 0.5, and then zero point 0.2. So you just add them all up, and you get a 25 quality adjusted life years for patient A. In patient B, you have a quality adjusted life year of 20, 20 quali. So just multiply the utility all over the number of years spent at that level of utility. So actually, patient A has a better quality of life. So going back now to cost effectiveness versus cost utility analysis. In comparison, no, the outcomes for cost utility analysis looks at single or multiple outcomes. It is not program specific, and it incorporates the notion of value because we're assigning value to the life years gained. So it's not just life years gained, it's quality adjusted life years gained. Okay, so because we are placing value to the number of years added to the person's lifetime. So you often find articles that would state that a certain health intervention uh, resulted in so and so qualis gained. No? It can also be reported as DALYs averted. DALYs refers to disability adjusted life years. So you don't want to live your life in a poor state of health or in a in a health that is disabled, no? So you want to avert or to avoid DALYs, whereas you want to gain QALYs. So a good intervention would help you gain quality adjusted life years. Also, a good intervention will help you avert or avoid disability adjusted life years. So when do we use cost utility analysis? When a certain condition, when looking at a certain condition, you're more concerned with the quality of life of that person. For example, a person living with arthritis may live up to 70 years old or 80 years old, but if he or she has a poor quality of life, then no, that person has low quality. Also in a stroke, no, it's also important to look at the quality of life. You also perform cost utility analysis when the intervention affects both morbidity and mortality. So you're not just concerned with the additional life years gained, but how does a person live in those additional years of life? Also, when the interventions being compared have a wide range of outcomes, and you just want a common unit of output for comparison. And lastly, when you are dealing with a limited budget, no, you take into account the quality of life of the person or the patient when you have a limited budget. The last of the economic evaluation strategies would be your cost-benefit analysis. Here, resources are consumed and health outcomes are measured both in monetary units. So you're looking both, the input is money, the output is also money. No? So will a health program's benefit exceed the cost uh, of setting up that program? And is there a positive net social benefit? No. However, cost benefit analysis is quite controversial because since we're looking at effectiveness and we're measuring it in terms of monetary units, it's like saying that you're placing monetary value to the health of a person or to the death of a person. Parang pinipresyohan mo yung buhay niya. The equation for your cost-benefit analysis is as follows. The cost that you would entail without using the program, without setting up the program, all over the cost entailed when you have the health program. So cost-benefit analysis, since both costs and consequences are all in terms of uh, monetary values, then it is only useful for cost-saving interventions only. Because you're not concerned with whether the patient lived a good quality of life. You're concerned whether the patient was useful and was able to to help in the economy because of the additional life years gained. So in summary, these are the different types of your economic analysis or your economic evaluation strategies. Cost minimization, you're looking at the cheaper option because you assume that the effects are the same. In cost effectiveness, you're looking at both the cost and the outcomes, but the outcomes have to be in a certain unit. They have to be the same unit in order for you to compare them. And the measure of unit used in a cost effectiveness analysis are usually your biological units, such as life years gained, reduction in HbA1c, reduction in LDL cholesterol, etc. In cost utility, you're also looking at the costs and consequences. However, the consequences are given valued or weights are placed on them through the use of utility. So you're looking at your QALYs and DALYs when you're talking about your cost utility analysis. And then cost benefit, I just mentioned a while ago, everything is valued in money, in monetary aspects. So in summary, we've looked at the way economics can help us in making decisions by finding which options are the most cost effective. So it always considers the output and the input and how we maximize the output based while also trying to keep our expenditures at a low level. And in medical economics, no, since we're uh, thinking about different perspectives, we should always consider the patient perspective, the health system perspective, and the societal perspective. And choosing the type of study to be conducted is partly dependent on which perspective you use. And lastly, the aim of economics is to help you choose the options that will minimize opportunity foregone and get the best opportunity for every peso that you have. So it's striking a balance between input and output. Okay, with that, I thank you for your kind attention.